Hello, everyone. Welcome to Durrett's Take. I'm doing a special episode with the college football playoff committee rankings coming up for the first time tomorrow. I wanted to kind of do a preview of what I think the committee may do for these rankings, since every year the committee's somewhat different. Um, so basically, I'm going to be going over what I think the committee will value the most. So that can include like strength of schedule, strength of record, good wins, good losses, and then bad losses, and then like eye test, head to head stuff, all those things. So let's get started. So basically, who's going to be one, two, three is kind of like the big question. Um, Based on, if you look at Indiana, Ohio State, Texas A&M's best wins, based on that, Indiana actually has the best win of the three because Indiana won at Oregon, which is better than Ohio State's best win, which is versus Texas, and then Texas A&M's best win, which is at Notre Dame. I mean, they're all good wins. Don't get me wrong, but Oregon is just a little bit better than all those. So therefore, and Indiana has the eye test, kind of like Ohio State has the eye test. India has the eye test to back up their undefeated record as well. Last year, you know, it, they didn't to a degree because when they faced against decent teams or good teams, they didn't look as good versus when they faced really bad teams. But India is obviously clearly better this year based on the eye test. So therefore, I would not be surprised if they had Indiana number one instead of Ohio State number two. I mean, it's Ohio State number one. So that'll be interesting to see. I'm gonna have Indiana number one, and then Ohio State two over Texas A&M for number two, just because Ohio State has wins against multiple ranked teams, and Texas A&M just has the one ranked team win. Um, Ohio State's eye test wise has looked better than Texas A&M, so I'd have Ohio State two and Texas A&M three, and then you get the three SEC one loss teams with Bama, Georgia, Ole Miss. Well, the way to sort that out is easy because of the head to head. Alabama has a bunch of good wins, obviously, and then they do have not a great lot, not so good of a loss at Florida State, but they have all the good wins. Eye tests are looking good right now, and more importantly, the head to head, like I said, matters. So Bama before over Georgia because Bama won at Georgia head to head there, and then we look at Georgia Ole Miss. Georgia beat Ole Miss, so they would be ahead of Ole Miss. So you got the 4, 5, 6 there. So then for the next spot, it's kind of like Oregon versus two Big 12 teams in BYU and Texas Tech. Um, Now, in the past, you know, they just love the Big Ten teams and the name brand like Oregon and all that. However, the committee is supposed to be, putting an emphasis on, who'd you be in strength of schedule, stuff like that. And honestly, I think the seventh spot, it would not surprise me if they go BYU here because BYU has one ranked win and they have a couple of decent wins, but Oregon has no ranked wins. Their only quote unquote good win was at Northwestern, which is like, eh. Now, of course, they have the best loss of anyone. Like the committee loves good losses, as I mentioned earlier. Um, and if Oregon had at least one top 25 win, then I think they would get that next spot. But since they don't have BYU there, and then you got Oregon versus Texas Tech, which is not a slam dunk either, because that depends on if the committee will realize, hey, Texas Tech's one loss was with the backup quarterback. So if they realize that and apply that, then Texas Tech should actually be above Oregon, since Texas Tech has multiple ranked wins. But again, if they don't recognize that, then Oregon may be above Texas Tech barely. But that would be kind of like the 7, 8, 9 spot there. Um, so now for you got a bunch of two-loss teams that are going to be in the battle there for like 10th, 11th, 12th spot. You like Notre Dame and then Texas Tech. I mean, not Texas Tech, Texas, Oklahoma, and Vanderbilt, all kind of, having arguments there. I I know Texas Tech, or no, sorry, get confused. I know Texas Longhorns haven't played like a top 10 team at times this season. However, out of all the teams in this category, Texas has to head to head over Oklahoma and Vanderbilt. So I would be surprised if they're not ahead of either of those teams. And then when you compare them against Notre Dame, Texas wins um, against Oklahoma and Vanderbilt are better than Notre Dame's best wins, which is USC and Boise State. Now, of course, again, Notre Dame has two good losses. They've looked a lot better since their 0-2 start. So they passed the eye test. But I feel like if you're going again based on resume, then Texas will probably be 10th, and then Oklahoma I'd say 11th because Oklahoma has a better resume than Notre Dame, um, and then they can go Notre Dame or Vanderbilt here, but I feel like they'll go Vanderbilt, just because, again, SEC two-loss team versus Notre Dame two-loss team, they typically favor the SEC there. So then you got the one loss ACC teams to figure out, okay, where to put them, because you got Virginia with one loss, Louisville with one loss, Georgia Tech with one loss. To me, Virginia obviously should be the first of the one loss teams in the ACC since they're the only undefeated team in the ACC. I think they'll be somewhere in the mid-teens. I don't think they're going to be top 10 just because they don't have a good strength of schedule. And then Louisville, Georgia Tech. Louisville will be the next one because they actually won on the road, upset Miami. They beat Pittsburgh as a good team, and Georgia Tech has one of the worst strength schedules in the country. They've been getting lucky, basically. So I feel like Louisville will also be the mid-teens, and then Georgia Tech will maybe mid-teens, but it may even be lower down. I wouldn't be surprised by that. And then you got more or less two lost teams in the mix with Miami, Utah, Cincinnati, Missouri, USC, Michigan, Washington. And now the kind of question is, okay, how to figure out all that? Well, even though Miami eye test wise is not looking good as of right now, like they did earlier this season, they have a solid resume, having that win against Notre Dame. I think Miami would be that, like, the best out of this bunch particularly, and then Utah would have next just because their two losses were really, really good losses to good teams, and they've dominated every other team that they played. Then I would have USC next because they have the tiebreak over Michigan head to head there, um, and then Michigan next because they have the tiebreak over Washington, and then Washington next, and then I think Cincinnati would be next. If Cincinnati would be higher, but just I feel like the committee's going to penalize for that blowout loss they had this past week. It's one thing to lose, but you can't get blown like they did. Um, and then I know Missouri could be higher, but I'm going to have Missouri kind of like at the low end of this group because when you look at Missouri's resume, their best win is a home win against Kansas. That's it. The mediocre team that like no ranked wins whatsoever. And their quarterback got injured in their last game too, and he's going to be out, so it's not going to be the same team. So I feel like they may be on the lower end, despite being a two losses team. And then the question is, okay, what's like the one last could a 3-loss team sneak into that top 25 in the committee's rankings? It could. The committee has a couple 3-loss teams to consider. I think they'll pick just one, and I think if they had to go on, I think they'll pick Illinois, especially since they are a top 10 preseason team and they at least have one ranked win. And all of their losses, 2 of their 3 losses were against the top 2 teams in the country, so that's understandable. So I think they could go Illinois there. And then the top G5 team to be ranked, again, you go a couple different options here, but I'm going to go with Memphis. And they have that bad loss to AB. It's just because they had that head over South Florida, which is huge. So now I'm going to go over like other teams that I left out here that could be considered at the start of the ACC. Pittsburgh would be the only other ACC team that would be under consideration to be ranked. But again, they have no top 25 wins and bad loss to West Virginia, so that's why they're out. Then with the Big 12, you got Arizona State, who's 6-3. The Sun Devils have a great win over Texas Tech, albeit against a bad quarterback. Great win there, and then the wins against TCU, Baylor, Iowa State, all above 500. Those are good wins. And then all 3 of the losses have been the teams over 500, so they've had good losses. I feel that if their star quarterback, Sin Levitt, wasn't injured, then maybe they would be the 3-loss team that's in the committee's rankings. But since he's out for the year, I feel like Arizona State would have to prove it in order to get into the committee's rankings. And then Houston at 7-2. Houston's win at Arizona State's obviously good, but to lose to West Virginia at home, that's going to keep them out of the rankings most likely. And then TCU is 6-2. They have a decent wins over SMU and Baylor, but again, that road loss to Kansas State back, when they weren't as good at that time, I feel like that's going to knock that to where they're not going to be in the top 25. And then the Big Ten, you got Iowa 6-2. The Hawkeyes dominated Minnesota recently, but again, they don't have any top 25 wins. Again, they have good losses, but no top 25 wins. Minnesota 6-3. Besides a win against Nebraska, again, Minnesota hasn't done much, deserve to be ranked. And then Nebraska, while they have a good win against Cincinnati in the season opener, it's been downhill kind of for them since then. And their quarterback's now out for the year. And then SEC, Tennessee is this 3-loss team. Now people are because Tennessee is actually in the AP poll, so that'd be interesting if they're not in the committee's polls. And I feel like the reason why they may be left out is because their only decent win was at Mississippi State, who's barely above 500. It's like all of their losses are against top 5 teams, so they have the good loss category. But again, they have no ranked wins at all, so I feel like that's why they may be left out. And then LSU, their resume is just horrible since Clemson's not as good as they were supposed to be. They haven't beaten anyone above 500, actually. So that's why they're going to be left out as a 3-loss team. And then other G5 teams to consider. You got South Florida, obviously. And they have obviously some good wins of Boise State to begin, the season. North Texas, they have a tiebreaker from Texas and dominated them at North Texas, which is a big win. And obviously, if you want to count Florida as a win, good win. I don't because they're under 500, but if you want to count that as a good win, then that's a good win. Um, and then you got Tulane at 6-2. They have good wins over Northwestern and Duke at home, who are both over 500, and even a good, decent win against East Carolina. However, the blowout loss to UTEP this past week, even though UTEP's just at mediocre, but that just blowout loss, I feel like that'll keep them out of Tuesday's rankings. And then versus if they won that game, they may even be in. North Texas is 7-1. North Texas had a soft schedule, and being Navy this past weekend was finally their first win of the season. They do pass the eye test though offensively, so that is undeniable. And the same with Navy, they passed the eye test offensively, but they just lost the first game of the season North Texas. I feel like they want to get in over them. And then two other G5 teams to consider it's not in the American, because there's a bunch of good teams in the American. San Diego State's only 7-1. They have a win over a P4 team, above 500 in California. And they have a good win at Fresno State, who's one of the other big, best teams in the Mountain West. They do have a bad loss at Washington State, which will probably keep them out of the rankings. And then James Madison, which was my preseason pick to be the G5 team making the playoffs. They lost a good game to Louisville, which I expected, but they've run the table since then. But the problem is their best wins are like Old Dominion, Liberty, so that's not going to stick out to the committee as of right now. But in conclusion, we'll see what the committee does tomorrow. I'm excited to see that. And then also, real quick, this week we got college basketball starting. So what I'm doing is I'm not going to go over my top, Final Four picks or anything like that, or go over a bracket. But what I will do is I will go explain the top 10, or not top 10, I guess, but just top games of the week this week. And since there are a lot of good teams, they're kicking off the college basketball season. So, for example, tonight you got number 3 Florida versus 13 Arizona in Vegas on TNT. That's a big game there to kick off, amongst the good teams, and then follow up after that is my BYU in Vegas, hosting Villanova. And then on Tuesday, the next day, this game will happen right after the college football playoff committee reveals rankings. It's Texas versus number 6 Duke. And then later on Friday night, you got Georgetown versus Maryland. I heard Georgetown could be, finally improved to be sneaky. We'll see what Maryland is with their coach and a bunch of their players leaving. We'll see if they're still good like they were last year. And then on Saturday, you got a couple good games, to mingle with the other good college football games. We got 15 Alabama versus 5 St. John's. That's going to be a good game. Then you got 14 Arkansas versus 22 Michigan State. John Calipari, Tom Izzo. That's a good matchup there. Oklahoma versus 21 Gonzaga to cap off that tonight. That's a good matchup. And then on Sunday, you got Indiana versus Marquette. Both teams, we'll see what they are. Texas A&M versus Oklahoma State. And then Washington versus Baylor. So a couple games to watch out for there. So make sure, I know, football is the main sport, and college football and NFL are looking good right now, but make sure to tune into college basketball and the NBA, but college basketball as well, and then that's kicking off. So thank you very much for listening to my podcast today. Please subscribe to my channel and tell about me. Thank you very much. You have a wonderful day.